Another set of spoilers from the upcoming Legends of Runeterra expansion have been revealed, this time focusing on the final region that hasn't been covered throughout spoiler season so far, Ionia. We've got another brand new champion being added to the game, along with some more cards spoiled that mainly support the new champion, but also have uses in other decks. In this video, we'll be covering the 6th champion revealed from the next set, Lee Sin, as well as the other new cards revealed. Just like in previous videos, we'll be talking about what Lee Sin does, along with the other spoilers shown, and I'll also be giving some initial thoughts on the types of decks Lee Sin and the other Ionia cards will likely fit best in. Let's jump right into it. As always, let's start off with the main course, Lee Sin. Lee Sin is a 6-mana champion from the Ionia region. He has 3 power and 6 health at level 1, and when you cast a spell during a round, give Lee Sin Challenger for that round. If you cast another spell during the same round, give Lee Sin Barrier. In order for Lee Sin to level up, you must cast 7 or more spells during the game. When Lee Sin does level up, he has 4 power and 7 health, keeps his level 1 abilities, and in addition, Lee Sin will Dragon's Rage any enemies that he challenges. Dragon's Rage is a 7-mana slow spell that allows an ally to strike an enemy and their nexus, but if the enemy survives, it's recalled. I just want to say that what's interesting here is that despite being part of Lee Sin's text, Dragon Rage is an actual card in the next set, and not just a mere skill that's attached to Lee Sin, like you see with other cards such as Commander Ledros. So I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about Lee Sin and Dragon's Rage together. I'll just give fair warning now, quite a few of these spoilers are going to be talked about in pairs, and you'll see what I mean once we get what the other Ionia cards do. So with Lee Sin, we're getting another champion that doesn't need to actually be in play in order to level up, which is always welcome. Although personally, I think Ionia didn't necessarily need another champion with this type of level up requirement, where you can just keep it in your hand until you hit the threshold. Yasuo doesn't need to be in play to level up, and neither does Karma, both champions in Ionia. As far as Lee Sin himself, this is the type of champion you want to play in a spell-heavy deck. In particular, I think you want to play him in a deck that has a lot of cheap spells and a lot of burst spells. Now, all of the cards spoiled along with Lee Sin do have synergy with him, but in my opinion, not all of them should be played in a Lee Sin deck, and we'll get to those cards later on. Ionia has a good amount of playable fast spells, like Will of Ionia and Deny, and even a few good burst spells, like Twin Disciplines and Spirit's Refuge. But none of those are exactly cheap. So we need to pair Lee Sin with a region that has the strongest cheap spells that will support him, and we prefer those spells to be burst spells, though they don't have to be. Fun fact though about Dragon's Rage, because it removes the unit that was blocking Lee Sin from play, even if it doesn't die, Overwhelm has some potential with Lee Sin, but I don't really want to get into it more since Might and Kato the Arm are pretty good cards, maybe even underrated, but I wouldn't say they're spectacular. So, what regions, and to go further, what decks are those? Well, first off, I think Demacia is one of the best regions to pair with Lee Sin. In particular, the deck I think Lee Sin works best in is OTK Elusives, also known as Elusive Burn. All the spells that the deck runs are either cheap, are burst speed, or are both. Purify stands out as one of the best spells you can play with Lee Sin, although it's fairly situational. Standalone is another great one. Even Chain Vest and Radiant Strike are decent burst spells and cost 1 mana. Lee Sin is excellent in the deck because he fits the game plan so well. A lot of times when playing that deck, you aren't even playing a unit unless you have enough mana to protect it with a spell. So you should be able to level up Lee Sin pretty easily. But even if you don't, you can drop Lee Sin and he can challenge something mid-game once you cast a spell. If they try to take him out with a spell of their own, you just cast something else to give him barrier. The only problem is that the deck already runs Zed and Fiora as champions, so one of them would have to be cut. I'd probably cut Fiora, since Zed with standalone is too good to pass up. So I'd look to replace Fiora with other cards. I'd also look to cut any copies of Cythria in the deck as well. One other region that I think has potential with Lee Sin is Piltover and Zaun. They don't have much as far as playable burst spells, but the vast majority of their good spells are cheap. Mystic Shot comes to mind, along with Get Excited, but I would probably try this deck with the new Gotcha spell over Get Excited. Granted, if the deck ends up playing Chump Wump, then Get Excited might still end up being better. There's also Flash of Brilliance, which refills your spell mana so you can play another cheap spell to give Lee Sin barrier in the same turn. Now, normally this card is played with Heimerdinger to create elusive turrets, and I actually could see Lee Sin pairing well with Heimerdinger. But one other champion that actually interests me even more is, surprisingly, Vi. Maybe the deck just ends up being a meme, but I like the idea of having a 1-2 punch combo of Vi and Lee Sin both challenging enemy units, especially since both aren't easy to remove. Our cheap spells mean that both Vi and Lee Sin will level up faster, at least once Vi is on the board in her case. As far as Dragon's Rage goes, I'll be brief. As an individual card, I don't think this will see play. 7 mana slow speed spells have historically been bad, with very few exceptions. And even those exceptions are debatable on how good they really are. The effect isn't powerful enough to justify running it under normal circumstances. You'd need to play it in a deck that has a lot of units with a very high power stat for the card to be worth it. It feels like a bad version of Atrocity. That's the best way I can put it. Let's jump into the other cards that were revealed with Lee Sin, starting off with Claws of the Dragon. This is a 2 mana follower that has 3 power and 2 health, and if you've played 2 spells during a round, you automatically summon this card from hand at no extra cost. This card's stats are par for the course for a 2 mana follower. You usually want these units to have at least 5 total stats between their power and health. However, the numbers are divided up. There is a lot of incentive to play this card in a spell heavy deck with Lee Sin, most likely in the Piltover and Zon pairing I mentioned earlier. One thing I'm curious about is whether or not this is played immediately as a blocker or attacker if both of the spells you play are burst spells. That way you could use this card to attack or block even after combat is initiated, similar to how Jury Rig works. If so, this card has a lot of potential in a deck with lots of burst spells. It'll be interesting to test out once the set releases. Let's take a little detour and talk about Scales of the Dragon next. This is a 3 mana follower with 4 power and 2 health, and when summoned, creates a Dragon's Protection in hand. So that theme I mentioned earlier when it comes to talking about cards in pairs starts here, and will continue for the rest of the video. But what did I mean just now about taking a detour? Well, I think this is the only card in this batch of spoilers that you don't necessarily play in a Lee Sin deck, or maybe even any deck. The reason being is that this card seems to be designed to play Dragon's Protection on itself to make it a 4/5, not so much other units. 4/2 is a pretty frail stat line for a 3 mana follower. Not only does it die to Mystic Shot, but it dies to the plethora of challenger units that have been in the meta at some point, and even some new cards that were previously spoiled. Not only that, Dragon's Protection is a slow spell, which means you need to proactively play this, and your opponent gets a chance to respond to it. At least if it was a fast spell, you could respond to your opponent playing something to remove Scales of the Dragon. So I don't think this card will even end up in spell heavy decks if they can help it. Next up is Tail of the Dragon. This is a 3 mana follower with 3 power and 2 health, and when this card is recalled, you transform it into a Concussive Palm. Now, Concussive Palm is an actual card in the game, unlike Dragon's Protection, but we'll be talking about both of these together regardless. So, I think Tail of the Dragon does have potential, but that potential can only be realized if we have a card that provides a constant recall effect. Something similar to what Minotaur Reckoner does with Stun, or what Rime Tusk Shaman does with Frostbite. We don't have anything like that for recall right now in Runeterra. Granted, if that type of card existed, it would have to be for your units only in order for it to be remotely balanced. Since we don't have a card like that, I think Tail of the Dragon is overall worse than Arachnoid Sentry, who gives you a body along with a stun effect. Granted, that stun effect is a skill, which plays like a spell at slow speed, but it's still a solid card. Almost as good as Frenzied Skitterer, in my opinion. Tail of the Dragon forces you to use your recall effects on it to get full value out of it, and that goes back to the idea of forced play patterns that I mentioned in my review of Vi. You don't want to play cards that force you to play a certain way, in general. For that reason, I don't think Tail of the Dragon will see much, if any, play in not just Lee Sin decks, but any deck that can't consistently recall its own units throughout the game. This is even despite another spell that was spoiled that we'll be talking about in a bit. Here is where things get interesting though. I do think Concussive Palm is a pretty good card. So this is a 4 mana fast spell that stuns an enemy to summon a Tail of the Dragon. Being able to respond to any unit and putting a Tail of the Dragon in play at fast speed can be quite strong. While these two cards do have synergy with Lee Sin, I think it's much more likely that Concussive Palm should be played in Yasuo decks if nowhere else. I do want to stress that even this card shouldn't replace Arachnoid Sentry. I think a better card to replace this with is Steel Tempest, a card you can only use on attacking units, whereas Concussive Palm you can use on any enemy. Steel Tempest is Yasuo's champion spell, so you're kind of already running 2 copies of that card naturally anyway. I don't see Concussive Palm in anything outside of Yasuo or Lee Sin though. I don't think it's a replacement for Decisive Maneuver, for example, since the decks that run Decisive Maneuver tend to be aggro decks that flood the board. It could be a tech slot though for something like Karma Ezreal. Let's get into the rest of the spells that were spoiled to finish things up. Starting with Sonic Wave. This is a 2 mana burst spell that gives an ally challenger for the round and creates a fleeting resonating strike in hand. The resonating strike is a 1 mana burst spell that gives an ally +2 power for the round. Sonic Wave is an amazing spell, not because it has this super powerful effect, but because of the utility it gives Ionia in general. Think about this. As of now, the only spell in the game that grants Challenger is On Guard, which is in Demacia. Also, the only Challenger card that Ionia has access to is Usari. Sonic Wave is a huge pickup for Ionia, because it means they don't have to go to Demacia if they want access to Challenger. Granted, Lee Sin himself also offers the region Challenger, but you may be an Ionia deck that doesn't want to play Lee Sin because he's too expensive for your deck. Or your deck is focused on playing units, not spells. Anyway, as far as where this should be played, I'm pretty certain every single Lee Sin deck wants to play this card simply because it offers a way to cast 2 spells for very little mana. Resonating Strike is kind of just an icing on the cake spell that allows you to give Lee Sin barrier for cheap. It's only 1 mana, so it really doesn't need to do much else other than offer +2 power to an ally. Ironically, Demacia could also make use of this card since you might not necessarily want to play On Guard to grant units Challenger, and Heimerdinger decks might actually want this card too. Giving a turret Challenger has some potential, especially since the normal Challenger turret you do get is a 0/1, and I think people underestimate the 2 mana 2/1 turret you get from your 2 mana spells. It has Tough, which means it doesn't die to ping effects like Withering Wail, among others. Anyway, Sonic Wave is great. Excellent utility spell for Ionia that makes them more flexible, both as a region on its own and in choosing other regions to pair with. Finally, we have Retreat. This is a 2 mana fast spell that recalls an ally to create a fleeting copy of Return in your hand. Return is a 1 mana burst spell that summons an ally that costs 3 or less from your hand. So this is the card I was talking about when it comes to additional recall effects that Tail of the Dragon needs, but it probably won't be enough in the long run for that card to have a continuous effect. This also has excellent synergy with Lee Sin, just like the other cards we've seen in this batch. But I can also see this played in Yasuo decks, especially if you retreat a card like Arachnoid Sentry and then play it again with Return to stun something else. I personally run Recall in my Yasuo list, and Retreat might end up replacing it. It does cost more mana up front, but I think when combined with certain units like Sentry, you end up saving mana in the long run, since it costs 4 mana to play Recall, then play Sentry again, for example, whereas Retreat and Return combined cost only 3. I think it's a solid card, but not every deck is going to play this. The effect is pretty specific. That's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like the video below or even share it with others. Both help to get the video out there to others in the community here on YouTube. I'll be looking to cover more of the new cards as they're spoiled, so if you don't want to miss those videos or any other videos I put out, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell icon. And feel free to follow me at the other social media places I hang out at. You can catch me streaming Runeterra live on Twitch, as well as hanging out on Twitter and even my own Discord. Links to all of those are in the video description. Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.